Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com with Taxes 101. So the point of this video audio is to just give you an illustration of what taxes are, how to think about them from an economics point of view, from an ethical point of view, etc. So at the end of the day, different people have different feelings on how much government there should be, what should government be doing within that, how much. But regardless, whatever a government of any size is going to require some level of funding. So when funding is done through sort of confiscation, basically by saying you must pay us this money whenever X transaction happens, it's referred to a tax. Specifically, especially when it's done by a government to fund whatever operations the government has. Cool. Now, from an ethical point of view, a lot of people have issue with that because basically your stuff is your stuff. So if the government just says, hey, you know what, give me 30% or else, it's kind of like very similar to a protection racket where basically they're saying, well, you know what, you're going to have to give us a portion of your money because we're protecting you. And if you don't pay us, we're not going to protect you. Actually, we're going to be the ones you need to be protected from. That kind of thing. Because that's what happens. If you don't pay your tax, they'll come after you, and they will first fine you. They will give you a lien on your wages. Eventually, they'll take the authorities and put you in jail, and it just escalates from there. So that's, again, sort of why, on an ethical level, why some people have a problem with it. But from an economic level, there's plenty of problems with it too. One is that it does have a increase of cost effect. So if you increase taxes on an individual, it's going to lower their income. So in that case, they're going to have less discretionary income, which they can use to save or consume beyond their basic costs of living. Now, if you put taxes on a business, that company is going to have to do something to accommodate. It's not going to just sit there and be like, oh, okay, I guess we're just paying more taxes. If they just pay more taxes, that means you're going to have a lower profit margin. And companies with lower profit margins are going to find it much harder to basically get investment capital versus ones with larger profit margins. So in that case, it'll either have a lower profit margin and have a lower access to capital going forward, if it ever needs capital to do some kind of cool investment or new project or anything like that. Or it has to find ways to increase its margin back, which means it has to cut costs. Or increase revenue. So it can cut costs by basically cutting labor. It can cut the quality if it's good. It can also increase revenue, hopefully, by increasing its price. So then what happens is that if we're talking about the things that people buy, you're now also increasing the price of living. So if we go back to that individual who just saw their income go down because they're paying more taxes, and now the taxes on that business turned into higher costs, their cost of living is going up at the same time that their income is going down, you're more likely to put them in the position where those two things overlap, and you've just made people poor. So that's another concern with taxation. So people will say, well, we need more taxation to fund these things that we want government to do. Well, then that raises the question, should even if you think of things that you would like government to do, should they do them if there's this cost in raising the revenue for it? And it's not just the income tax. There's all sorts of different types of taxes, and each of them sort of distort the way people behave in different ways. And they all have the same effect, whether on the individual or the business. And they'll have similar responses. So there's income taxes that are going to range based on what you make. There are sales taxes that are what you buy. But this is where we start getting into the work of Cecil Pigou, who talked about sort of if you tax something, you'll get less of it. So if you tax people's purchases, they're going to buy less stuff because, well, you're punishing them every time they buy. This is why people do what's called a sin tax, where they'll tax something like cigarettes a whole lot in order to discourage people from smoking, although that has adverse effects as well. Because oftentimes, a lot of vices are things that generally people who are more disadvantaged may use more proportionately. So then what's going to happen is that tax ends up falling much heavier on people who are disadvantaged, making it what's called regressive. Okay, the term of regressive tax is any tax that structurally will fall harder on more disadvantaged people, and a progressive tax, which is a tax that structurally will fall higher on more advantaged people. So that's a thing with sin tax. But on top of that, also, the more you tax something, eventually the tax gets so high it becomes prohibitive. So eventually you make taxes, or you make cigarettes so expensive that people just don't want to buy them. And they're like, well, that was the point. Problem is, it doesn't mean they don't want them. They just you end up forming black markets. As we've seen happen in like places like New York, where basically people end up buying packs of cigarettes, places where it's cheaper to buy a pack of cigarettes, like a state or two over, and then go and sells it to them under the table to people in New York who don't want to have to pay the large sin taxes. So this black market then also creates a situation where people have run-ins with law enforcement, because now law enforcement has to enforce the law, and this just creates all sorts of new friction and injustice within the system. So taxes can sometimes advertently create black markets. And that creates all sorts of justice issues. So we don't just have the issue of people's economic situation where they're seeing their incomes depleted and their cost of living rising, but you're also creating justice situations that don't need to exist, which just creates, more friction between enforcement and people's daily lives. Other effects is, again, sort of that whole investment effect. That's what's important, because what happens is a lot of time people manipulate the tax code, and they'll get tax credits for this business and tax deductions for this business. We'll increase taxes on this business. And what this does is it tinkers around with the different available profit margins for different industries, which then tinkers around with their availability for capital. Because again, if I'm an investor, what I care about is my return on my investment. It doesn't matter where I invested in, as long as my return is sufficient for the amount of risk that I'm taking. So if you're making businesses that have a little bit more, businesses that are maybe a little bit more riskier to invest in, have a little bit less return, they're not going to be able to raise the capital to really develop those industries. So you're going to end up starving certain industries of capital, not because people wouldn't want to invest in them otherwise, you've just kind of ruined the calculus. And vice versa, you may have other industries that are overly, just basically because of the way these things kind of relatively work out, now they have too much capital. And what happens is that capital is so available, it ends up creating all sorts of price increases and all sorts of other issues in that area, because the capital isn't being distributed in a smart way, because you're destroying the signals that would normally help capital get distributed. So taxes distort the way investment occurs. They damage people's incomes, they increase the cost of living, and also can create all sorts of really crazy justice situations. So at the end of the day, we can say that there must be an extent. If you believe that there's some level of government that must occur, whatever that level of government you must say, or you may say that, hey, some level of taxation must exist. But you got to really think to yourself, do we really want to have more government that's absolutely necessary? Is the trade-off of what taxes can cause worth what we're asking government to do? Now, what's the right answer to these questions? Well, each person has to kind of sit there and grapple with these questions themselves, but we can't ignore that there are trade-offs when you tax more that have to be balanced against whatever the values of any policy that you want to put in place, and thus meaning you want to make sure that you can measure the efficacy of that policy. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. If you enjoy these videos, you can find more at alexmerced.com. Find my podcast on Spotify, Google,